to the Action Podcast. Here's your host, my dad.
Well, welcome back to the second episode of Season 3. Today we follow up and conclude this two-part series with Molly LaCroix. So if you haven't listened to part 1, go ahead and pause this episode now and go back to the first episode, and then you can make your way back here. Today, Molly talks about more internal family systems, or the IFS model, and how it is integrated with our faith. We also talk about her book, Restoring Relationship, and how it can be purchased at her website, mollylacroix.com. Well, let's get into it. Here's the second half of our conversation. There's a part in the book that I wanted us to spend a little time talking about, where you talked about bonding and attachment. And the reason I think it's important for us to talk about it, and I want to give you a little bit of time to do that, is because so many times people will come into a therapist because whatever they're dealing with is only related to what they're going through in that moment. And it's really difficult for us to tie back some of the early adverse child experiences that we have early in life. And you really spent some time in the book talking about those things, because I think sometimes we want to dismiss that phase, that season of life.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think it's the activity of our protectors is why we wanted to dismiss that. We want to minimize it because it's painful to go back to those experiences. And in the book, I really want to help people open compassion for our vulnerability. Mm-hmm. You know, and I preface that section of the book by looking at Jesus' life, and everything from conception to the cross was vulnerable. And so I really believe that there's redemption of vulnerability, as we are meant as followers of Jesus to be able to be with each other in our vulnerability. And that requires us to be with our own vulnerability first. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we will be blocked to really being with someone else's. And so I launch into this second part of my book that I tried to bring some tough concepts into some simple language to really help people understand that the nature of our relationship with our earliest caregivers is formative in terms of how our brain develops. Yes. You know, when we come into this world as humans, our brain is not very developed, and every experience we have shapes that brain. And, attunement is one of the words that we use, is, how attuned is the caregiver to the child? And that means not only are they responding to their needs, but are they responding in a way that meets that particular child's temperament? Mm-hmm. So if a parent is loud and boisterous with a child who is sensitive, like from a sensory standpoint, that's going to be difficult and scary for that child. And so, there is no perfect parent. As parents, we do our best. And so inevitably there's rupture in that attunement, in that attachment. And the good news is a repair in rupture strengthens the attachment. And so again, a good enough parent recognized, oh, whoops, I just tried to make light of my child falling. And then they realize, oh, she's really hurt herself. And they can apologize and repair. Some of us have that good enough experience, and we are what we call securely attached. Yeah. There are other cases where people don't have a good enough experience and there isn't secure attachment. Now, my perspective is that it's not all that black and white. Mm-hmm. That even if someone does the assessment and comes out securely attached, that does not mean that they didn't have any experiences as a young child when their brain was very immature that wounded them. Right. Because again, a parent can be very well intentioned and still do something that the child interprets as I'm unlovable.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really, it's overwhelming because then, as you say that as a parent, you think you start going through your brain of, do we let our daughter cry it out? Do you want to be there? I don't want her to feel abandoned, all of these kinds of things. The great thing that if anybody's listening and they're feeling that anxiety is going, God created us with plasticity. Our brain is malleable. And everything that you're saying is going that there are ways that we are able to work through these types of things. But I think it's important for us to recognize that I think a lot of times we don't even look at the bonding and attachment phase as stuff that could be affecting us later in life. And that's, I think, that the dots that it need to be connected.
That's right. And so back to that point, so our brain is busy recording all these experiences and it's being shaped and it creates what we call mental models. And these are ways our brain filters experience that are outside of conscious awareness. And they do it. So they do influence us in adulthood, let's say, but we don't recognize that that's what's going on. So we're reacting to somebody, another adult, let's say, and it's being filtered through experiences that we had very early in life. And one of the ways that I talk to clients about this is sort of a little self-assessment is if our reaction to something feels disproportionate, that's a clue that it's coming from something that happened earlier. So if someone, let's say, is in a workplace environment and their supervisor gives them some feedback and it's pretty, it's reasonable. It's, if a third party looked at it and said, well, that was helpful, you need to grow in that area and they handled that well. But let's say this person goes home and they can't sleep and they can't eat and their inner critic is just clobbering them. Mm-hmm. Well, this is about more than just this one interaction with the supervisor.
Yeah, that's great. And I always say, let's look at the stimulus. Is the response appropriate for whatever the stimulus is? And oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes to hear the stimulus is down here. I know people can't see me because we're on a podcast, but then the response is up here. An interesting thing that I found, obviously over the last year and a half, or almost 2 years, things have changed. And during the beginning of the pandemic, some of the stimulus was actually very high. And I had clients that were saying, my anxiety's up. Is this an appropriate response? And I said, well, actually, the stimulus is up. I'm your therapist. My anxiety is higher than it normally would be. And that's kind of a good measurable assessment to kind of look at yourself and going, am I operating out of a maladaptive part or am I operating out of in a response to whatever the actual situation is in front of me?
Right. Yeah.
I usually use the thing is going, if a bear is in front of you, you should respond appropriately. If there's no bear there and you're responding to the world as if there's a bear there, then you're probably responding out of a part.
That's right. Yeah. And it's something that is being influenced by one of those early experiences that got stuck, that got stuck. And again, to your point, that doesn't mean, it can't get unstuck, that there is a way to work with that. And, and again, with parents, I know it's always it's just talk about vulnerable. Being a parent, I have 3 grandchildren now. My daughter has 2 little girls. My son has a son, and, just watching those little ones form. But repair, there are 2 main things: is to remember the power of repair, and to remember that if, as parents, we do our own work, that is the greatest gift we can give our children. And so if there is something where a parent is showing up with a child and they know that they're really not meeting the child's needs and they're really struggling, that's just a signal that they've got some work to do. And probably being a parent stirs up all of our own early stuff. And so it's an ideal time to do that work.
Molly, can you talk to me a little bit about the concept of forgiveness and how that plays into all of this? And you were kind of right there, kind of alluding to it. I want to go into how, because I think forgiveness on many levels, externally and internally, play a big part of how protectors, how wounds, but just how the self operates. Talk to me a little bit about forgiveness.
Yeah. Well, I see forgiveness as a process. The act of forgiveness, the capacity to forgive, I believe, is innate. I believe that is a quality we possess because, again, we're created in God's image. And Scripture is so clear about the need to forgive. I don't think God asks us to do something we're not able to do. Yeah. So let's say we have this innate capacity for forgiveness, but that doesn't mean it isn't a process. Because it is. Yeah. And one of the things we haven't said yet about the IFS model that I really love is that it's a constraint release model, meaning we have these resources that we need for healing, for being loving, for relating with one another, but they get constrained by these burdens in our system. Yeah. And so our forgiveness can be constrained because, if there's something we need to forgive, there's been a wound, there's been a breach. And so the process is to, like any other healing process with this model, is we start with the protectors. We might have a protective response of, I can't forgive that person, they don't deserve it, or, whatever that is. And we connect with that part of the system until it trusts us enough to show us, essentially, what are you afraid would happen if we did forgive? And that's the kind of gateway to the exile. The fear, because our protectors are driven by fear. And when they are able to articulate their fear, we're going to see what happened in the past, And then we can go heal that wound. And that releases the constraints to, again, this, what I believe is an innate capacity to forgive. And again, whether it's ourselves or someone else.
Yeah. And the unforgiveness process can keep us stuck, which is a big part of the problem.
And it's usually, again, I think the activity of protectors, they're stuck for a reason. Yeah. And so rather than trying to beat ourselves into submission and, right. And say, well, you have to forgive because look, here's the verse that says you better forgive. No, I don't think that's not a grace-filled, loving approach. And so we have to start with that protector who's stuck in unforgiveness.
Yeah. I think sometimes when you were talking about fear, that is such a big component to this whole process. And when you were saying that, I get this vision of to help kind of communicate that is when it's fear that's driving it. Sometimes externally, it doesn't look like we're fearful, but it's fear underneath it. And when I see, I'm thinking about a parent in the front yard and their kid runs out into the street and they just start screaming and yelling out of anger. Underneath that is the fear that something might be happening to them, but it's a very heightened level response. But underneath it is fear. It doesn't always look like fear. When we talk about, now we're going to kind of move into addiction, underneath what may look like an alcoholic, or it could be just this wounded, fearful part.
Yeah. Well, addiction is probably deserves a podcast all of its own.
Well,
right?
You and I talked about it yesterday, and there very well may be one coming.
Yes. So, but in a nutshell, what the perspective in this model of addiction is that it is an activity of a part of the system. Like I said earlier, could start out as a firefighter, might morph into more of a managerial. I know if I get up today and I drink, I can get through the day. That's more of a managerial strategy. But let's just make it simple. It's a protective strategy to numb out or disconnect from pain.
Yeah.
And the more intense the wounding, the more intense that protective strategy has to be. Yeah. And so what we have learned in recent years is at the root, particularly of really intractable substance abuse, is trauma. And so usually complex trauma. It's not just one-time traumatic event. It is probably someone you kind of alluded to. Maybe you've talked on your podcast about the adverse childhood experiences. And, so being raised in a context where there wasn't good enough parenting, where maybe there was abuse, where a parent was either mentally ill or using substances as well. So it just this pile of trauma.
Yes.
And at some point, the pain of all that is too much for the system to handle. And so a part of the system figures out, if I use that drug or I drink, I won't feel that anymore.
Yeah.
And, and so you can see it's, again, positive intention. Yes, in the case particularly of substance abuse, the damage is extreme. And yeah, there is a physical toll of that as well. But it starts as an adaptive response to pain.
Yeah. I mean, the moment we open up scripture, we go into Genesis, it doesn't take us very long to get to Adam and Eve. And they make a decision that God essentially was saying, if you touch of the tree, if you eat of the tree, and we can see instinctually they avoid. They start to hide and they go into an avoidant behavior, and they're I mean, it kind of cracks me up, because I can't imagine living in communion the way that they were with God and then thinking we're going to cover ourselves in our shame and our guilt and everything. But that's the first instinctual thing we see the first creation of man do. It doesn't surprise me that we're constantly looking for avoidance, for escaping. You mentioned, alcohol, drugs, pornography. I see it with a lot of my clients with video games and virtual reality. It's like, I don't want to be in the existence that I'm experiencing. I want to alter it.
Yeah. And so when we can approach that process with compassion and an understanding of this part means well.
Yeah.
And usually with addiction, it can help listeners to imagine a triangle. Mm-hmm. So an inverted triangle. So the base is at the top, the point's at the bottom. At the top of that triangle, there's two protectors. There's the one that is more that firefighter that comes in and uses the substance or the activity to numb out. And then there's probably the manager who's a critic.
Yeah.
And that's the one that they hear from the next day when they spent all night gaming and they can't get themselves out of bed to go to school or work. And the critic is there just berating them. Yeah. And both of those protectors are aware of the same underlying exile.
Yeah. I'd like to read this part, and this is out of the addiction chapter of your book. And you said, fundamentally, addiction is any repeated behavior, some substance related or not, in which a person, or what we would think of as a part of a person, feels compelled to persist regardless of its negative impact on their life and the lives of others. That just then opens up the can. Talk to me a little bit about that, because I think that then you have to start getting really real about yourself. And that means every person who's listening.
That's right. And that then we're not scapegoating a portion of the population and saying, well, they do that, but I don't, because that all right there, that's not loving.
Right.
When we see it as this is human adaptation to pain. So we can look at, well, how do I adapt? And yes, for some of us who've been blessed enough not to experience complex trauma, our adaptations aren't as extreme. Right. And so it might be more in the realm of a distractor in our system who just, by 4:00 in the afternoon or 5:00 in the afternoon, it's like, don't you want to stop working? Don't you want to do something fun? Right. And that's inherently positive. So we can also say, pulling it up out of a pathologizing perspective and say, our systems strive for balance, and we're supposed to not just work. We're supposed to play. God doesn't want us to just work. And so some of these parts of our system, again, that aren't so burdened, are just a distractor that's like reminding us, don't just work, shut the computer and go spend time with your family. But when the underlying wounds are more severe, then those behaviors become more intense. And in my book, I tell the story of a young man who ended up with a substance abuse problem, and talk about the parts of the system and this adaptation to pain. And then I have an example of a middle-aged, successful career person who also meets all the criteria for having an addiction, but his is to go to the gym every day at a certain time. Mm-hmm. And so, it's just a matter of degrees.
Yeah. And it's certainly, when you look at it like that, we probably have a lot of things in our culture that we wouldn't look at as, oh, that person has an addiction. But when we can recognize some of these behaviors and patterns in our life, we can start to develop some empathy for maybe other people, which is really my point in pulling that out, is going, I think it's very easy to put people into boxes and go, oh, he's just a heroin addict, or he's just this, or she's just that. But then when we really look at our lives going, you know what, the behavior externally looks different, but the place it's coming from, I might have a part of me that's demonstrating an addict, but nobody really notices because it's not something we culturally look down upon, like going to the gym.
It would be something we celebrate.
Exactly. It could be a relationship. I've had conversations with parents who put so much of their children on a pedestal that it becomes unhealthy, that their whole life is taking care of these children, which is a good thing, but it can become an addiction because it's feeding an unhealthy part of whatever is going on within us. That's
right. Yeah. And in the scripture talks about idolatry. I mean, if you think about it, why are we prone to that? And that is, again, it goes back to that wounding. And so it opens compassion when we see someone who has an extreme struggle, let's say, we can know it's proportionate to the pain in their system.
Yeah.
And so then, when we focus on that instead of on the ways they've adapted, we can feel much more compassionate.
Yeah, I feel like I'm already seeing it in the future that you and I are going to have another conversation around specifically that chapter, but really unpacking the addict in all of this. I want to get to, because I'm also looking at the clock and I want to be mindful of your time. And you and I talked a little bit about then, what do we do with this? Like, what is the spiritual practice? Like, if somebody's listening right now and it's like, okay, all of that sounds great, and I can relate and connect with that. What do I do with that now? What do we do?
Yeah, well, there's a process, and I do call it a spiritual practice because I like people to think of it as, I love the word practice because it takes us repetition to learn things. And we don't just pray once and we're done with prayer, or worship once and we're done with worship. And in this, it's about building relationships with these internal family members. And the first step of that is just awareness. It's just turning our attention inside. If people listening are familiar with the term mindfulness, that's all mindfulness is. It's about paying attention to what's going on inside. Now, we take it much farther because this is about relationship. And so when I notice, it's the start of a new year. So let's say somebody made a resolution. They could start by getting curious about, wonder what part of me thinks I need to make that change. What's the motivation behind this? And just to get curious, to begin to connect. And we call it befriending. It's just having a conversation. And so it's a practice of noticing. Parts show up as thoughts. Often they show up as sensations in our body. If there's something kind of that catches someone's attention, that seems persistent, is always around, that's a good place to start. Can I get curious? I like to start with curiosity as one of these qualities of the leader of the system, because that's kind of a low bar. Can I at least be curious? It would be really easy if one part of us showed up at a time.
Right.
That's not usually the case.
That's right.
And so in assessing ourselves, as we want to, let's say someone wants to get curious and connect with a part of them, they want to notice, is there, if any other part doesn't like this one or thinks they should get rid of it, or every time they try to pay attention to it, their mind goes blank, that's a part that's blocking connection. And so you're going to have to start there. So it is kind of there's a lot of patience involved in this.
For sure. And the other thing I want to say is, in your book, there are after chapters exercises that you can do. So if somebody's listening and they're like, I want to understand more of this, I want to be able to practice more of this, there's more of that in your book. So I rather than, spending the next 4 hours of you and I being that's the reason we write books, is being able to go, hey, here's a little bit of what is going on between the pages of this book. And I just think it's great to be able to leave with, here's some ways to practically put this into your life. You and I talked a little bit yesterday. Then if somebody's listening and they're going, this is great, but I'm in a place of real and serious distress, that might be then the time to go maybe seek somebody outside, maybe a therapist or somebody like that. Talk to me a little bit about how do we know when we get to a point where it's maybe beyond just us spending a little time being mindful and bringing somebody who maybe has a license into the equation?
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes it's the intensity of the symptoms, when whether the symptoms are individual or relational. If things are in more of a crisis state, then your system is really dysregulated. And then it makes it really hard to connect with these different parts on our own, because there are probably a lot of them present, and it's much more complex. And that's going to take a seasoned, trained professional to guide you through the process. Yeah. When things aren't in crisis, when life's going along pretty well, but you notice, well, gosh, every time my husband does this, I snap at him, and I want to get to know that part of me. That's a whole different scenario. Sure. Yep. And and in terms of being able to do that and just to kind of experience it, and then people sometimes will experience it and say, oh, whoa, I need help with this. Yeah. The appendix of my book walks through this process. So there are exercises, and then I summarize it all in the appendix. And if listeners are interested, they can go to my website, which is mollylacroix.com. And if you subscribe to my newsletter, you get a little download that walks you through this process also.
And I'll put all that in the notes, your website and everything, so that they can find that. I think it's really important that we recognize that whether it's a work setting, a home setting, a social setting, if in certain areas of our life we're not functioning at a level, the distress levels are getting to a point where they're not manageable, that's when you start noticing, okay, maybe I need to seek out professional help. And I think it's really good, because I think some people's threshold for different aspects of these things are different. And yes. I always try to share, because I'll have friends, peers, people at church come up to me and go, do you think I need to see somebody about this? And it's like, well, I don't know, because I don't know, I don't know your ability to process this stuff. But I think if you're not able to, if you're noticing distress levels in some of the different areas of your life, or getting to the point where you're not functioning at a level where you feel, I don't know what the word would be, okay, that's when we start leaning into what would be clinical. Molly, anything else? Oh, you know what? The one thing I did want to, before we go, you're now working on another book. I wanted to give you an opportunity just to kind of tease a little bit of that and share with our audience what to be looking forward to.
Oh, good. Yeah. I'm just in the early stages, but I'm pretty excited. As I alluded earlier, I really believe healing happens when these different parts of us, whether they're protective parts or whether they're exiles, when they get to tell their story. That what we learn as IFS therapists is really how to create space, what I think of as sacred space, for these parts to really tell their story. And so that's in this second book. The working title is From Exile to Shalom, How Ancient Stories Lead Us to Healing and Wholeness. And each chapter will start with a story from the Bible. And I'm going to take, the basic story that's in scripture, and I'm going to expand on it, using my imagination to imagine the different parts of this particular person in their circumstances and what their circumstances provoked in them in terms of both protective responses and their wounding, and as a bridge into our own stories. And so each chapter will provide a skill that we need in order to be able to create this space to listen to our part stories. And so some of it will be like understanding, well, who's listening when we're telling a story? And that's really these qualities of the leader of the system. And I'll go through, some of the skills of differentiating these different parts, as well as how can I be present with shame? How can I be present with grief? Because these are the big emotions that scare our protective parts. And so my goal is to, just help people lean into their stories. And hopefully, especially with that content, I'll probably do some kind of course to be able to do some group work with that.
That's great. I love that. And we'll have you back when that comes out for sure. No question. The book is called Restoring Relationship. You can get that at your website, and I will put that in the notes. So if anybody wants to go directly to that, and then if people want to find you on all of the social media sites that we utilize, how would they find you there?
Yeah, so I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Molly LaCroix, LMFT. So they'll find me there, and I do a few posts a week, just trying to help people learn this practice, learn this way of understanding themselves. And then if they sign up for my emails, they'll just get one a month from me, again, with some kind of a topic of, here's how I approach, say, anger, or here's how I approach grief.
That's great. And LaCroix is LaCroix, just to make sure everybody knows that as they're seeking out all of these things. Well, Molly, I've enjoyed our time together today, but getting to know you through Mark Loomis and our time last summer, and then just kind of building up to this and through email and text and stuff, I really appreciate your heart and what you're doing. So thank you so much for your time and your willingness to spend your afternoon with me on the podcast. I just really appreciate you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Well, I am very grateful for my time with Molly and having her bless the podcast with her knowledge and kindness. I've received a lot of really great feedback already from our first episode with her, and how they've really enjoyed this series. We have a lot happening in this third season, and I have a great conversation lined up for our next episode that will discuss marriage and a whole lot more. We appreciate your comments and your ratings that you put on all the streaming sites, and thanks for allowing us to continue to make these podcasts, and you sharing them really helps. Well, until next time, or when our Savior comes, God bless.